The floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse offered a glittering, omniscient view of the city, yet it was a shadow in the reflection that made the perfect evening suddenly feel suffocating. A single unsent message glowing on a locked screen, a fleeting glance across a crowded dining table. These are the quiet tremors before the earthquake. There are devastating secrets hidden behind the most flawless marriages, waiting patiently to tear everything apart. If you find yourself drawn to the beautiful, dangerous ruins of a life built on lies, stay here with me. There is a heavy price to pay when the truth finally breaks the silence, and you won't want to miss how this story ends. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gold Coast penthouse offered a glittering, omniscient view of Chicago, a sea of amber and white light stretching out toward the ink-black expanse of Lake Michigan. Yet Nathaniel Whitmore's attention was entirely tethered to the dining room. As a senior architect at Wright Architecture, he made his living out of recognizing structural flaws. He knew exactly how much weight a load-bearing wall could take, and he knew the precise breaking point of tempered glass. Lately, he couldn't shake the creeping sensation that his marriage was suffering from microfractures invisible to the naked eye, but structurally catastrophic. Kendall Martin, she had kept her maiden name a testament to her fierce, carefully branded independence in the PR world, sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. She was laughing, the crystalline sound bouncing perfectly off the high ceilings. She looked breathtaking in a minimalist black silk slip dress, the very picture of the affluent, effortlessly chic American wife. She held court among their dinner guests, spinning an anecdote about a recent charity gala with the practiced, flawless ease of a politician. Nathaniel swirled the Cabernet in his glass, watching her. He loved her. He had designed this life, this very penthouse, around her tastes, her ambitions, her need for light and space. But over the last few months, a hollow distance had settled between them, a cold draft in a house where all the windows were supposedly bolted shut. "You're miles away, Nate," Tom Harrison murmured, leaning in slightly so his voice wouldn't carry over the jazz playing softly from the hidden speakers. Tom, his closest confidant at the firm, was perhaps the only person in the room who didn't entirely buy into the flawless aesthetic of the Whitmore Martin household. He possessed a cynical, fiercely observant nature that Nathaniel usually found grounding. "Just admiring the view," Nathaniel replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Right," he said, his gaze drifting lazily across the table. The view. The view at that exact moment was Chad Hunter. Chad, a prominent and aggressively ambitious real estate developer they had recently partnered with at the firm, sat 2 seats down from Kendall. He exuded the kind of arrogant, inherited wealth that Nathaniel inherently distrusted. But it wasn't Chad's heavy gold watch or his perfectly tailored Italian suit that caught Nathaniel's eye. It was the silence. In a room full of overlapping animated conversations and the polite clinking of expensive silver against porcelain, there was a heavy, pregnant quiet between Kendall and Chad. It wasn't the comfortable silence of strangers. It was the taut, synchronized silence of 2 people who were hyper-aware of each other's physical presence. Nathaniel watched his breathing slowing as Kendall reached across the linen tablecloth for her water glass. At the exact same second, Chad shifted his forearm on the table. For a fraction of a second, the back of Chad's hand brushed against the inside of Kendall's wrist. It was nothing. An accident. A symptom of a crowded dining table. Except Kendall didn't flinch. She didn't pull away instinctively or offer a polite, dismissive apology. Instead, her fingers tightened momentarily around the crystal stem of her glass, her knuckles turning a faint ghostly white. Her breath hitched just slightly, a tiny erratic disruption in the rhythm of her chest that only a man who had memorized her every habit would ever notice. And Chad didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the woman speaking across from him, but a slow, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the absolute pit of Nathaniel's stomach. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt overwhelmingly thin, devoid of oxygen. It wasn't a smoking gun. There were no hushed whispers in the hallway, no lipstick smeared on a collar. It was just a brush of skin, a shared silent frequency, vibrating underneath the polite dinner chatter. But the architect in Nathaniel saw the crack in the foundation. It ran deep, right down to the bedrock. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist on the mahogany or demand an explanation. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, the expensive vintage, suddenly tasting like ash on his tongue, and smiled across the table at his beautiful wife. The demolition of his life had just begun, and the truly terrifying part was how quiet the first swing of the hammer had been. The last guest had departed just past midnight, leaving behind the lingering sense of expensive cedarwood cologne roasted garlic and the heavy floral sweetness of Kendall's perfume. The penthouse was suddenly suffocatingly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the industrial dishwasher in the kitchen and the distant, muffled wail of an ambulance siren down on Michigan Avenue. Nathaniel stood in the center of the master bedroom, slowly unknotting his silk tie. The frosted glass door of the ensuite bathroom was closed, the shadow of his wife moving fluidly behind it as the shower ran. For a long time, he just stared at that shifting silhouette, the ghost of the dinner table incident, still playing on a relentless loop in his mind. The phantom brush of skin, the white knuckles, the smirk. He turned away, needing a physical distraction to break the mental spiral. Kendall's black velvet clutch rested precariously on the edge of the velvet chaise lounge, where she had carelessly tossed it after seeing the guests out. As Nathaniel reached down to move it to her vanity, the unfastened metal clasp gave way. The bag tipped, spilling its meager contents onto the thick cream-colored wool rug. A tube of designer lipstick, a silver compact mirror, a small tin of mints, and a rectangular piece of matte, unbranded black plastic. Nathaniel knelt. He ignored the cosmetics and picked up the plastic card. It was thick, heavier than a standard credit card, equipped with a discreet magnetic strip and an embedded RFID chip. There was no hotel logo, no room number, only a tiny embossed serial code in the bottom corner. As an architect who frequently designed high-end hospitality spaces, Nathaniel knew exactly what he was holding. It was a VIP access card for an exclusive boutique hotel or a private luxury residence, the kind of place designed specifically to keep secrets securely locked behind soundproof, reinforced doors. He turned the cold plastic over in his palm. His pulse strangely did not race. Instead, a terrifying, absolute stillness washed over him, starting from the base of his spine and freezing the blood in his veins. Just then, the screen of Kendall's phone, resting face up on the marble nightstand a few feet away, flared to life. It was completely silent, the device meticulously set to a scheduled "Do Not Disturb." But the sudden burst of blue light in the dim room was impossible to ignore. Nathaniel stood up, the black hotel key card still gripped tightly in his hand, and walked over to the nightstand. He looked down at the glowing screen. It was a notification from an encrypted messaging app he didn't even know she had installed. The sender's name was saved simply as a single initial C. The notification preview was turned off, a deliberate security measure, leaving only a vague, chilling alert. One new message, 1:18 a.m. The math was brutally simple. The equation balanced perfectly, leaving zero margin for error. The synchronized tension at the dinner table. The unmarked hotel key. The hidden encrypted midnight message. A lesser man might have thrown the phone against the floor-to-ceiling window. He might have kicked the frosted bathroom door open, demanding the Broughton amidst a storm of tears, shouted accusations, and shattered glass. But Nathaniel was a builder. He understood structural integrity better than anyone. He was staring at the undeniable proof that the foundation of his 10-year marriage was completely hollow, eaten away by a rot he had somehow failed to see. The house was already dead. It just hadn't collapsed yet. Carefully, with the steady, precise hands of a surgeon, Nathaniel placed the hotel keycard back into the velvet clutch. He gathered the lipstick and the compact, snapping the clasp shut, and set the bag exactly where she had left it. He did not touch the glowing phone. When the shower shut off and Kendall finally emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a plush white robe and smelling of lavender and hot steam, she found her husband sitting on the edge of the mattress. He was looking out the window at the dark, freezing expanse of Lake Michigan, his expression completely unreadable, his heart having quietly fortified itself into an impenetrable vault of ice. The drafting room at Wright Architecture was a sanctuary of straight lines, precise measurements, and predictable outcomes. Suspended fluorescent lights cast a sterile, shadowless glow over the massive oak tables where Chicago's skyline was endlessly reimagined. For the past 3 weeks, this room had been Nathaniel's only refuge from the suffocating theater his life had become. Every morning, the routine was executed with terrifying perfection. He would wake up beside Kendall, brew her preferred pour-over coffee, and press a chaste kiss to her temple before leaving for the office. He played the part of the slightly overworked loving husband flawlessly. He learned to smile with his mouth while his eyes remained entirely dead. He learned to listen to her complain about the demanding clients at her PR firm without screaming that he knew exactly how she was spending her late-night strategy sessions. The sheer cognitive dissonance of it was exhausting, an emotional phantom limb that ached continuously. "You're drawing a load-bearing column right through a ventilation shaft, Nate," a voice noted dryly. Nathaniel blinked the sudden intrusion, pulling him back to the architectural blueprint spread across his desk. Tom Harrison was leaning against the doorframe of Nathaniel's private office, holding two steaming paper cups of black coffee. Tom possessed a cynical, sharp-eyed demeanor, the kind of man who noticed the subtle shifts in room temperature before anyone else. "Right," Nathaniel murmured, methodically erasing the thick graphite line. He didn't look up. "Just a minor miscalculation." Tom walked in, closed the heavy glass door behind him, and flicked the privacy blind shut with a sharp twist of his wrist. The sudden isolation in the room was palpable. He set one of the coffees down over a schematic of a commercial plaza. "I've known you for 8 years," Tom said, pulling up a steel-framed stool and sitting across from him. "You don't make minor miscalculations, and you certainly don't look like you've been sleeping roughly 2 hours a night just because we're behind on the West Loop project." Tom paused, his voice dropping an octave, stripping away the workplace banter. "What is actually going on with you?" Nathaniel carefully set his drafting pencil down parallel to his ruler. He looked at the graphite smudged on his fingertips. If he said it aloud, it would become real. It would no longer be a silent truth locked in his own head. It would be a tangible reality existing in the world. "Kendall is having an affair," Nathaniel stated. His voice was perfectly level, stripped of any inflection. It sounded like he was reporting a structural defect in concrete. "With Chad Hunter." Tom didn't gasp. He didn't offer a platitude or a look of profound pity. He simply sat back, exhaling a long, slow breath, his dark eyes analyzing Nathaniel's terrifyingly calm exterior. "Are you absolutely certain?" A VIP hotel key in her clutch, encrypted messages at 1 in the morning, and a dozen other microscopic details I was too blind to see until I actually looked. Nathaniel finally raised his eyes to meet Tom's. They were completely devoid of warmth. "I need a favor, Tom, and I need it to stay completely off the firm's radar." "Name it," Tom replied without hesitation. "I need the name of the most ruthless, quietest divorce attorney in the city, someone who specializes in high-net-worth asset extraction, and I need a forensic accountant." Nathaniel picked up his coffee, the cardboard sleeve hot against his palm. "I am going to dismantle this marriage. I am going to untangle every shared account, every investment portfolio, and the deed to the penthouse. But she cannot know until it's entirely finished." Tom stared at him for a long moment, recognizing the dangerous, absolute resolve in his friend's posture. He reached into his suit jacket, retrieved a sleek silver pen, and grabbed a post-it note from the desk. He scribbled a name and a private cell phone number, sliding it across the blueprints. "He's expensive, he's a shark, and he doesn't leave a trail," Tom said quietly. "Are you sure you want to play it this way? Nate, no confrontation, no counseling." Nathaniel picked up the yellow square of paper, folding it meticulously into quarters. "You don't counsel a burning building, Tom," he whispered. "You just get your valuables out before the roof caves in." The boutique hotel suite on the 42nd floor of a sleek glass high-rise was a masterpiece of discreet luxury. It smelled of ozone fresh linen and the faint citrusy tang of expensive champagne. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight, sealing the room off from the blinding mid-afternoon Chicago sun, creating an artificial twilight that felt both intimate and dangerously isolating. Kendall lay against the headboard, the thick Egyptian cotton sheets pulled up to her collarbone. She watched Chad as he stood across the room by the mahogany dresser, already dressed in his tailored trousers, and a crisp white shirt, nodding his silk tie with practiced, almost dismissive efficiency. He was checking his phone, his thumb swiping rapidly across the screen, his mind clearly already miles away from the tangled bedsheets. To Kendall, this emotional distance was intoxicating. She mistook his predatory detachment for complex depth and his need for absolute secrecy for a consuming passion. In her mind, this affair was not a betrayal, it was an awakening. The PR world demanded she be perfect, composed, and endlessly accommodating. With Nathaniel, she was the flawless wife. But here in the shadows of this unmarked hotel room, she felt unburdened, dangerous, and utterly alive. "I have a zoning board meeting at 4, Chad murmured, not looking up from his device as he slipped on his heavy gold watch. "You can stay as long as you like. The room is booked through tomorrow." "I should get back to the agency anyway," Kendall replied smoothly, feigning an independence she didn't entirely feel. She wanted him to linger to pull her back into the bed, but she knew the rules of the game. Clinginess was a liability. An hour later, freshly showered and perfectly composed, Kendall stepped out of the elevator and into the quiet, sun-drenched foyer of her own penthouse. The transition from illicit lover to devoted wife was seamless, a performance she had perfected over the last 3 months. She found Nathaniel standing at the massive marble kitchen island. He was dressed in a simple charcoal sweater, his head bowed over a scattered array of architectural blueprints in manila folders. "Hey," she said softly, dropping her keys into the silver bowl by the door. She walked up behind him, placing a manicured hand lightly on his shoulder. Beneath her palm, Nathaniel's muscles went completely rigid, turning to stone. He didn't flinch, nor did he pull away, but the physical withdrawal was palpable. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slid a wide architectural schematic over the manila folder he had been reading. A folder that, had she looked closer, contained a forensic accountant's detailed breakdown of their joint investment portfolios. "Long day?" Kendall asked, her voice laced with manufactured sympathy. She began to massage his tense shoulder, entirely misinterpreting the stiffness. "You've been so quiet lately, Nate. You barely slept last night. Is it the West Loop project? Is Tom giving you a hard time?" Nathaniel stared straight ahead at the stainless steel appliances. His eyes were dark, flat, and impossibly cold. He measured his breathing, ensuring the rhythm remained perfectly even. "Yes," Nathaniel answered quietly, his voice devoid of any vibration. "It's a structural issue. We are finding out that the foundation is completely compromised. It's taking a lot of careful planning to figure out how to separate the load safely before the entire thing collapses." "You'll figure it out," Kendall soothed, leaning in to press a kiss against his cheek. She smelled faintly of the boutique hotel's expensive lavender soap, a scent that made a phantom wave of nausea roll through Nathaniel's stomach. "You always fix things." "I do," he agreed softly. Kendall smiled, completely satisfied, and turned on her heel to head toward the master bedroom to change. She felt perfectly secure, deeply loved, and entirely in control. She walked away, completely blind to the terrifying reality that she was standing on an empty stage, and the man she thought was her husband had already turned out the lights. Tuesday morning arrived with the bruised gray light typical of a late Chicago autumn. Inside the penthouse, the silence was absolute. For Nathaniel Whitmore, this was not just another workday. It was the final meticulous stroke of a demolition he had been quietly orchestrating for weeks. He stood in the master walk-in closet, the thick wool carpet muting his footsteps. There were no suitcases to pack. He had been discreetly moving his essentials into a leased corporate apartment in River North over the past 14 days, carrying out a few shirts at a time. A single pair of shoes slipped into his gym bag. What remained here were just the props of a ghost. Kendall was still asleep, her breathing soft and rhythmic, her face half buried in the down pillows. Nathaniel paused at the bedroom doorway, looking at her for what he knew would be the last time in this context. There was no anger left in him. The furious, burning betrayal of the first week had completely calcified into a heavy architectural apathy. He didn't want to hurt her. He simply needed to no longer exist within the same structure. He walked into the kitchen. The morning routine was a deeply ingrained habit, so he honored it one last time. He ground the beans, the harsh noise briefly shattering the quiet, and poured the dark roast into her favorite ceramic mug. He left it steaming on the edge of the marble island. Then Nathaniel raised his left hand. The platinum wedding band felt unusually heavy against his skin. He slid it past his knuckle with slow, deliberate ease. The metal made a sharp, definitive click as he set it down on the cold marble right next to the coffee mug. Beside the ring, he placed a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed logo of Chicago's most ruthless family law firm. He didn't write a personal note. There was nothing left to say that the 50-page legal document inside didn't perfectly articulate. He picked up his briefcase, walked to the front door, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy reinforced door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing briefly before sealing the tomb. 12 hours later, the sun had long since drowned in the lake when Kendall finally unlocked the penthouse door. She was exhausted yet still humming with the residual dangerous thrill of a hurried illicit afternoon drink with Chad. "Nate," she called out, slipping off her designer heels by the entryway. "I'm so sorry I'm late. The agency was an absolute nightmare today." Her voice died in the dark hallway. The penthouse was entirely unlit, the heavy silence pressing painfully against her eardrums. It wasn't the peaceful, comfortable quiet of a husband reading in the study. It was a vacuum, a terrifying structural void. Frowning, she padded into the kitchen and flipped on the overhead ambient lights. The first thing she saw was the untouched coffee, a dark, stagnant film pooled on its cold surface. Then she saw the glint of platinum. Kendall stopped breathing. She approached the kitchen island slowly, as if the floorboards were rigged to collapse beneath her. She stared at the ring, recognizing the tiny microscopic scratch on the band from their honeymoon in Santorini. Her trembling fingers reached for the thick envelope. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a single, devastatingly clinical letter from an attorney she had never heard of. It spoke of irreconcilable differences, the immediate separation of joint assets, the changing of the penthouse locks scheduled for the following morning, and a formal request that all future communication be directed solely through legal counsel. There were no furious accusations of her affair. There were no heartbroken pleas or demands for an explanation. There was only the terrifying absolute precision of a man who had recognized a fatal flaw in his foundation and coldly excised it. Kendall sank slowly to the hardwood floor, the heavy, expensive paper slipping from her grasp, entirely alone in the echoing emptiness of the life she had just thrown away. The morning sun reflected harshly off the steel and glass canyons of the loop, a blinding contrast to the dark, suffocating panic tightening inside Kendall's chest. She had not slept. She had spent the entire night sitting on the floor of the empty penthouse, the divorce papers scattered around her like debris from an explosion. By 10 a.m., driven by a frantic, animalistic need for an anchor, she bypassed her PR firm entirely and took a cab straight to Hunter Development. Chad's executive suite was a monument to modern power. It was vast, minimal, and overwhelmingly cold, dominated by a massive slab of black marble that served as his desk. When Kendall bypassed his startled executive assistant and pushed open the heavy oak doors, she expected sanctuary. She expected the man who had whispered dangerous, intoxicating promises in dimly lit hotel rooms to drop everything across the floor and tell her that everything would be all right, that they were finally free. Chad did not look up from the architectural scale model he was examining. He was dressed flawlessly in a navy bespoke suit holding a silver laser pointer. "I explicitly told Sarah no interruptions." Chad said, his voice clipped his attention solely on a miniature high-rise. "Nate left," Kendall blurted out. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual melodic, practiced polish. She stepped further into the room, her designer coat hanging awkwardly off her shoulders. "He left me, Chad. He moved out. He filed for divorce, and he knows everything." The silver laser pointer flicked off. The silence that followed was not the heavy, charged quiet of their illicit dinners. It was the absolute sterile silence of a boardroom right before a hostile takeover. Chad finally straightened up. He didn't rush toward her. He placed the pointer carefully on the marble desk, his brow furrowing not in sympathy but in profound irritation. "What do you mean he knows everything? Does he have proof? Are there names in the filing?" Kendall stopped halfway across the Persian rug. The desperate rush of adrenaline in her veins suddenly turned to ice water. "Name's Chad, my marriage is over. He packed his things and left his ring on the counter. I'm completely alone." "Kendall, listen to me very carefully," Chad said, his tone lowering into a dangerous, commanding register. He walked around the desk, stopping several feet away from her. There was no affection in his eyes, only a calculating risk assessment algorithm processing the data. "Wright Architecture is bidding on the West Loop zoning project alongside me. Nathaniel Whitmore sits on that committee. If my name gets dragged into a messy public divorce scandal with a senior architect's wife, it's going to be a massive liability for my firm." She stared at him, her breath hitching in her throat. The charismatic, passionate lover from the 42nd floor hotel suite had entirely vanished, replaced by a ruthless corporate developer looking at a bad investment. "Liability," she whispered the word tasting like ash. "Is that what I am? We love each other. You said I say it a lot of things, Kendall, Chad interrupted smoothly, his voice devoid of any real emotion. He checked his watch, a fleeting, devastating gesture of dismissal. We had an arrangement. It was exciting. It was an escape, but you didn't honestly believe I was going to play stepdad to your midlife crisis, did you? You need to call a lawyer. You need to keep my name entirely out of it, and you need to leave this office before you cause a scene. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet precision of his rejection was far more destructive than a shouted argument. Kendall stood frozen in the center of the vast, expensive room. She looked at the man she had burned down her perfect life for, finally seeing the hollow, selfish reality beneath his tailored suits and expensive champagne. She had mistaken a temporary distraction for a permanent foundation. Without another word, she turned slowly and walked back out through the heavy oak doors, stepping into a cold, unforgiving city where she was now truly terrifyingly alone. The private dining room at the Drake Hotel was usually Kendall's natural habitat. She knew the exact angle of the ambient lighting that best flattered the cheekbones, the precise etiquette of exchanging air kisses, and the subtle art of steering a conversation toward her PR firm's latest triumphs. Today, however, beneath the cascading crystal chandeliers and the towering arrangements of white orchids, the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated execution chamber. It had been 10 days since Nathaniel's silent departure. High society in Chicago did not scream. It whispered. The news of the Whitmore separation had not been formally announced, yet it had permeated the atmosphere of the Gold Coast like a toxic, invisible gas. It was the addition of Chad Hunter's name to the rumor mill that had ultimately sealed her fate. Kendall smoothed the skirt of her tailored navy suit, forcing her spine to straighten. She scanned the room and spotted a table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sitting there were Victoria Elena and Sophie Women, who just a month ago had drunk her wine, praised her taste, and treated her as an indispensable pillar of their inner circle. Taking a slow, measured breath, Kendall walked toward them. As her shadow fell across their table, the animated, overlapping conversation severed instantly. The sudden silence was so absolute, it made a ringing sound in Kendall's ears. "Kendall," Victoria said first. The word was perfectly pleasant, yet entirely devoid of warmth. It was the exact measured tone reserved for a stranger asking for directions on the street, not the woman who had co-hosted Victoria's winter gala. "Hello, ladies," Kendall replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the violent hammering against her ribs. She placed her hand lightly on the back of an empty, velvet-upholstered chair. "Mind if I join you?" Elena looked down at her untouched mimosa, tracing the rim of the flute with a manicured finger. Sophie suddenly found the intricate stitching on her designer clutch fascinating. It was Victoria who delivered the killing blow, offering a tight, deeply sympathetic smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Oh, darling, we would love that, but we were actually just leaving," Victoria lied smoothly. "Sophie has a fitting across town, and I have an urgent board meeting I simply can't miss." Nobody moved to stand up. The lie was exposed, resting right there on the crisp white linen between the silverware. But social protocol demanded they all pretend it was the truth. Kendall looked closely at their faces. She didn't see anger. She saw morbid curiosity, quiet judgment, and the profound, palpable relief that the scandal was hers, not theirs. In this glittering world, a quiet, amicable divorce was a tragedy. A messy, illicit affair that threatened the delicate social equilibrium was an unforgivable crime. By choosing a fleeting thrill, she hadn't just broken her marriage, she had broken the rules of their ecosystem. She was a contagion, and they were quarantining themselves. Slowly, Kendall pulled her hand back from the chair. Her fingers felt numb. The physical isolation in the crowded, echoing room was suffocating. She realized then that she was no longer Kendall Whitmore, the brilliant strategist and half of a power couple. She was a liability. A cautionary tale to be discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. "Of course," Kendall said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "I wouldn't want to keep you." She gave a stiff, mechanical nod and turned away. As she walked the long, agonizing distance toward the heavy oak exit doors, she did not look back. But she didn't need to. The moment she was out of earshot, the rhythmic clinking of silver forks and the low, steady murmur of their voices resumed behind her. The collective machinery of her former life had effortlessly closed the gap, continuing on flawlessly, as if she had never existed at all. The digital clock in the corner of Nathaniel's computer monitor flipped to 2:14 a.m. Beyond the expansive glass walls of Wright architecture downtown Chicago was a grid of desolate streets and amber streetlights swept clean by a biting November wind. Inside the firm, the only illumination came from the harsh, articulated halo of Nathaniel's desk lamp. He was hunched over the drafting table, a mechanical pencil moving in rapid, aggressive strokes across a vellum overlay of the West Loop project. He had been operating with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a machine for 4 weeks. Leaving Kendall had been a tactical extraction. He had successfully secured his assets, maintained his professional composure, and severed the toxic limb before the infection could spread. He told himself it was a victory of logic over emotion. Yet the sterile corporate apartment he now returned to every night was agonizingly quiet. There was no familiar scent of lavender, no soft rustle of silk, no maddening, beautiful presence to anchor him. The anger that had fueled his precise departure was slowly evaporating, leaving behind a vast, echoing chasm of grief he refused to look into. "You're going to tear the vellum, Nate." Nathaniel didn't jump, but his hand froze. The graphite tip of his pencil pressed hard enough against the drafting board to snap. Tom Harrison stepped into the pool of light, his tie loosened, a heavy wool coat slung over his arm. He didn't look like a man stopping by for a late-night chat. He looked like an intervention. He reached out and deliberately placed his hand over Nathaniel's, forcing him to lower the broken pencil. "The load-bearing calculations are flawless. The aesthetic is perfect." Tom said, his voice quiet but carrying a heavy, undeniable authority. "But you've been staring at the same elevator shaft for 3 hours. You haven't been home since Tuesday." "I'm behind schedule," Nathaniel muttered, his eyes remaining fixed on the smudged lines. "The committee needs these revisions by Friday." "The committee can wait," Tom countered. He pulled up a stool, sitting close enough that Nathaniel could smell the sharp chill of the outside air clinging to his coat. "I let you handle the divorce your way. I gave you the lawyer. I watched you pack up your life without making a sound. But I am not going to sit here and watch you try to draft your way out of a hemorrhage." Nathaniel tightened his jaw. "I'm fine, Tom. It's handled. The paperwork is filed. It's just a transition phase." "It's not a transition. Nate, it's a burial," Tom said bluntly. He leaned in, forcing Nathaniel to finally meet his gaze. Tom's dark eyes were completely stripped of their usual cynical humor, replaced by a profound, uncompromising empathy. "You engineered a perfect silent exit. You took away her power to fight back, and you protected yourself. But you are a human being, not a concrete pillar. You spent 10 years building a life with a woman you loved. It is completely, entirely destroyed, and you haven't grieved for a single second of it." The words hung in the sterile air of the drafting room, heavy and terrifyingly true. Nathaniel tried to summon the cold, protective apathy that had carried him through the last month, but the reservoir was utterly dry. He looked at the broken piece of graphite resting on the flawless architectural drawing. The absolute control he had maintained suddenly felt incredibly fragile. Slowly, the rigid posture of his shoulders collapsed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the edge of the drafting table, and buried his face in his hands. He didn't cry, the tears were still locked away somewhere too deep to reach, but a long, jagged breath shuddered through his chest, the sound rough and utterly broken in the quiet room. For the first time since the night of the dinner party, Nathaniel Whitmore allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of the falling debris. Tom didn't say another word. He simply sat there in the dim light, keeping watch, while the architect finally let the ruins crumble. The penthouse, once a magnificent showcase of open-concept design and natural light, had transformed into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar tomb. It was past midnight, and a freezing December rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the Chicago skyline into a blur of weeping lights. Kendall sat on the floor of the hallway, her back pressed against the cold drywall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She had not turned on the heating system. Nathaniel had always managed the complex smart home panel, and now the ambient temperature of the apartment matched the freezing desolation in her chest. In her trembling hand, the harsh blue glare of her smartphone illuminated her pale, exhausted face. She was staring at their text message history. The timeline was a brutal chronological map of her ruin. Just 2 months ago, the screen was filled with mundane, loving exchanges, grocery lists, flight itineraries, and inside joke about a pretentious wine they had tasted. Now, beneath that history of a shared life sat a graveyard of desperate, unanswered pleas. Nate, please. I just need 5 minutes. Sent Monday. I know what I did is unforgivable, but the lawyers are being ruthless. Can we just talk? Sent Wednesday. I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. Sent yesterday. Beneath every single message sat the agonizing clinical stamp delivered. Never read, never a typing bubble. Just an endless digital void. She swallowed hard, the back of her throat burning with unshed tears. The isolation had stripped away all of her carefully branded PR polish, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out shell. She needed to hear his voice. She needed him to scream at her, to call her every vile name she deserved, to shatter a glass against the wall, anything to prove she still mattered enough to provoke a reaction. With a shaking thumb, she pressed the call button. 4 miles away in a starkly furnished corporate apartment in River North, Nathaniel stood by the kitchen counter. He was pouring hot water from a kettle into a ceramic mug, the steam rising softly into the quiet room. On the granite countertop, his phone began to vibrate, a harsh rhythmic buzzing that shattered the peaceful silence. He set the kettle down slowly. He looked at the illuminated screen. Incoming call, Kendall. For a fraction of a second, the phantom muscle memory of a decade-long marriage urged his hand forward. But the man who would have answered that call had died in the master bedroom of the Gold Coast penthouse weeks ago. Nathaniel stared at the glowing letters spelling her name, feeling a profound, heavy exhaustion, but absolutely no desire to pick up. He understood now that engaging with her pain would only pull him back into the wreckage. His silence was not a tactic of revenge. It was the ultimate necessary quarantine. He didn't hit decline to send her straight to voicemail. That would be an action, an acknowledgement. Instead, he simply turned away, picked up his tea, and walked toward the living room, leaving the phone to vibrate itself into exhaustion on the cold granite. Back in the dark hallway of the penthouse, Kendall listened to the automated operator. "You have reached the voicemail of..." She lowered the phone, letting it slip from her fingers onto the hardwood floor with a dull clatter. The rain continued to beat against the glass. No anger, no hatred, no explosive confrontation could have ever dismantled her soul the way his absolute echoing silence did. She buried her face in her hands, finally breaking down into jagged, breathless sobs, completely alone in the dark, screaming into a void that simply no longer cared to listen. Kendall sat in the glass-walled conference room of her PR agency, the embossed lettering of her own name on the frosted door suddenly feeling like a cruel joke. Across the polished oak table sat Richard Vance, the CEO of Vance Holdings. As her firm's anchor client, his account single-handedly kept the agency's profit margins in the black. Richard was a man of old Chicago money, inherently conservative, and crucially an avid golf partner of the senior partners at Wright Architecture. "We are terminating the retainer, Kendall," Richard stated. His voice was not angry, merely profoundly disappointed and final. He didn't even glance at the meticulously prepared campaign deck she had slid across the table. Kendall felt the blood drain from her face, a cold prickling sensation spreading across her scalp. "Richard, if this is about the quarterly projections, I can assure you that my team is fully equipped to..." "It has nothing to do with the projections," Richard interrupted smoothly, folding his hands over his leather portfolio. He looked at her with the exact same icy detachment Victoria had used at the charity luncheon. "My firm's brand is built on trust, integrity, and absolute stability. In our circles, reputation is currency, and right now yours is bankrupt." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "I respect Nathaniel Whitmore immensely. The board simply cannot justify aligning our public image with an agency whose leadership's private judgment is so dangerously compromised." The words were a physical blow, shattering the very last illusion she had clung to. She had arrogantly believed her PR agency was a fortress entirely immune to the wreckage of her marriage. She thought her professional brilliance could outshine her personal failures. But in the incestuous, unforgiving ecosystem of Chicago's elite, everything was intricately connected. When she betrayed Nathaniel, she hadn't just broken a vow, she had severed her own professional lifeline. She didn't argue. There was no PR spin she could apply to this reality. She nodded slowly, the room spinning slightly, as Richard stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and walked out without offering his hand. Hours later, Kendall unlocked the door to a sterile two-bedroom rental in a nameless high-rise in the South Loop. The Gold Coast penthouse was gone, liquidated and locked away by the aggressive maneuvering of Nathaniel's lawyers. This new space was a stark landscape of stacked cardboard boxes and stiff, rented furniture. It smelled of cheap industrial carpet cleaner and profound defeat. She dropped her keys onto a laminate counter that mocked the memory of her expansive marble island. There was no ambient jazz playing from hidden speakers, no glittering view of Lake Michigan, no incoming emails from eager clients. Her phone lay silent in her purse. She walked into the center of the beige, empty living room and stood perfectly still. The silence here was fundamentally different from the silence in the penthouse. In the penthouse, the silence had been the agonizing absence of her husband. Here, the silence was the absence of absolutely everything. Her marriage, her social standing, her career. The lover who had ruthlessly abandoned her at the first sign of inconvenience. The ultimate price she had paid for a few fleeting moments of dangerous thrill in a dimly lit hotel room wasn't just a brutal divorce settlement. It was the complete annihilation of her identity. She sank to the cheap, scratchy carpet, pulling her knees tightly to her chest as the twilight shadows lengthened across the bare white walls, finally terrifyingly grasping the absolute finality of her ruin. She was entirely alone, trapped in a cage built entirely by her own hands. The mahogany conference table at the law firm of Sterling and Cross felt like a surgical theater. It was wide, polished to a mirror finish and entirely devoid of warmth. Outside the tinted floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago winter had firmly set in, painting the sprawling city below in unforgiving shades of slate and frost. Nathaniel sat across from his attorney, a ruthlessly efficient man named Marcus, who spoke in measured billing hour increments. Between them lay a meticulously stacked pile of heavy watermarked documents. It was the final divorce decree. "This is the last of it, Nate," Marcus said smoothly, tapping an expensive silver pen against the margin of the top page. "Once you sign here and initial the appendices, the dissolution is legally binding. The asset transfer is complete, the joint accounts are permanently severed, and the property liquidation is finalized. You are officially unencumbered." Nathaniel looked down at the documents. The thick black ink formed the dense legal terminology of a dead marriage, reducing a decade of shared history, laughter, and ultimate betrayal into a neat stack of contractual obligations. He reached out and picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and heavy against his fingers. For a fleeting moment, the sterile walls of the boardroom faded. He saw the ghost of a summer evening in Santorini, the way the Mediterranean wind had caught Kendall's hair when she first said her vows. He saw the original blueprints of the Gold Coast penthouse, recalling how he had drawn every single line with an absolute blind devotion. He waited for the familiar, suffocating spike of anger to hit his chest. He waited for the bitter resentment that had kept him awake for months. But it didn't come. Instead, he felt a profound, heavy stillness. The jagged, bleeding wound of her betrayal had finally scarred over. He realized in the quiet of the boardroom that the true opposite of love was not hatred. It was this resonant, absolute apathy. He didn't hate the woman who had broken him. He just recognized that the structure she represented was fatally flawed, and he simply no longer wished to reside in it. He understood now that true survival wasn't merely about escaping the collapse. It was about having the quiet strength to bulldoze the charred remains, clear the debris, and leave the plot of land completely empty until the ground was steady enough to build upon once again. With a steady, deliberate hand, Nathaniel pressed the pen to the paper. The sharp scratch of the nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the room. He signed his name. He turned the page and signed again. He executed the final demolition of his past life without a single tremor in his hand. "Done," Nathaniel murmured, sliding the heavy stack of documents back across the polished mahogany. Marcus gathered the papers into a leather folio, a faint professional smile touching his lips. "You handled this exceptionally well. Most men in your position let their pride and their anger cost them everything." "Anger is an unstable foundation, Marcus," Nathaniel replied quietly. He stood up, smoothing the front of his charcoal suit, and picked up his overcoat. He took the silent elevator down to the lobby and stepped out onto the freezing, windswept pavement of LaSalle Street. The winter air was biting violently, stinging his cheeks, but for the first time in 6 months, his lungs did not feel constricted. He exhaled a long, slow breath, watching the white cloud dissipate into the gray afternoon sky. The ruins had been cleared. The ground was finally level. He turned his collar up against the chill and began to walk forward step by step into the cold, clean architecture of a new life. 14 months had passed since the divorce decree was signed. The city of Chicago was wrapped in a thick, muted blanket of January snow, softening the harsh architectural edges of the skyscrapers and dulling the roar of traffic along Michigan Avenue. The holiday lights had long been taken down, leaving behind the stark, unforgiving reality of deep winter. Nathaniel Whitmore walked out of a warm, wood-paneled coffee shop, the brass bell above the door chiming lightly behind him. He was dressed in a heavy tailored charcoal overcoat, a thick scarf wrapped securely around his neck against the biting wind. He held two steaming cups of dark roast, one for himself, one for Tom Harrison, waiting back at the newly completed West Loop site. Nathaniel looked remarkably grounded. The heavy dark circles that had haunted his eyes a year ago were entirely gone. His posture was relaxed, his stride even and purposeful. He was a man who had survived a catastrophic collapse, methodically cleared the debris, and finally built a new life on a structurally sound foundation. He paused at a busy intersection, waiting for the pedestrian signal to change. The snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, melting into the wool collar of his coat. Across the crosswalk, waiting for the exact same signal, stood Kendall. The contrast was immediate and devastating. She was swallowed by a shapeless dark parka that looked a season too old, a far cry from the effortlessly chic designer coat she used to wear. The flawless, expensive blowout she used to meticulously maintain was gone, her hair pulled back into a hasty, messy knot. The brilliant PR executive who used to command elite dinner tables with a single glittering smile now looked impossibly fragile, her shoulders bowed under the weight of an invisible, crushing gravity. She clutched a cheap plastic pharmacy bag, staring blankly down at the gray slush forming in the gutter. The pedestrian light flipped to a glowing white walk symbol. The crowd stepped off the curb simultaneously, a silent, bundled flow of dark coats and umbrellas moving through the falling snow. They walked toward each other. In a city of nearly 3 million people, the intersection suddenly felt terrifyingly empty. Halfway across the street, Kendall lifted her head. Her breath caught instantly, a visible puff of white vapor freezing in the air. She stopped entirely in her tracks. The plastic bag slipped a fraction in her gloved hand. She looked at the man who had once been her husband, the man whose quiet devotion she had traded for a fleeting, disastrous thrill. Her hollow eyes widened, flooded instantly with the desperate, agonizing hope that he might say something, that he might show a flicker of the love or even the explosive hatred that would prove she still mattered to him. Nathaniel didn't stop. His steady stride didn't break. As they passed within 2 feet of each other in the center of the crosswalk, he looked at her. He didn't glare. He didn't sneer. His dark eyes simply registered her presence with the mild, distant recognition one might give a stranger they vaguely remembered from a forgotten lifetime. There was no anger left in him to give. There was only the calm, absolute distance of a man who had successfully and permanently closed the door. He gave a small, polite nod, a mere reflex of basic human decency, and kept walking forward into the snow, never once looking back. Kendall remained completely frozen in the center of the street as the indifferent crowd moved around her. The traffic signal began to blink a warning orange. The ultimate price of her betrayal crashed down on her. Not in a courtroom, not in an empty apartment, but right here on the freezing pavement. She turned her head slowly, watching his broad shoulders disappear into the white swirling blur of the city. He was entirely healed, moving steadily toward a future he was designing without her. She was entirely hollow, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life she had chosen to throw away, realizing with absolute agonizing certainty that the cold silence he left behind would deafen her for the rest of her life.